Welcome everybody to the Middle East Institute. My name is John Calabrese, and for the past 15 years since I returned to Washington, I've been teaching at American University, and I've had the privilege of serving here at the Middle East Institute as a scholar and on the editorial staff. Normally I lurk in the shadows, but today I decided that the opportunity was irresistible for two reasons. To share with you this event and this level of expertise. Number one, the reason why I'm happy to be here in front of you today is that this event coincides with the official launch of the Middle East Institute's Middle East to Asia program, cleverly disguised by the acronym MAP. I hope that our interns downstairs circulated basic information about that project to you and how you could contact me if you're interested in affiliating with the project. Since its inception just several weeks ago, we've managed to enlist as affiliates over 100 scholars, diplomats, researchers, and businessmen from 25 countries across, I guess what you could say is maritime Asia, east, west, and south. And I'm sure the numbers of those people and the diversity of them will increase as the project gets off the ground. And I encourage you to contact me with suggestions as to how to make this work as the months and years go on, both in terms of topics that we could cover, individuals that we could bring to Washington, and dialogue and exchange of ideas and expertise that can help enrich our understanding of the extensive ties that already exist between the Middle East and Asia, and that I'm sure are going to grow in the years to come. The second reason why I'm happy to be here is because this is an opportunity for me to learn from three distinguished experts more about China and the Middle East at a time when China itself is in a constant process of evolving, and the Middle East, I guess to put it mildly, is in a state of transformation or turmoil. The catalyst for this event actually is not me, but is the gentleman sitting to my left, Sam Chester, who will serve as the moderator. He himself is one of the rising stars in a new generation of young academics, future researchers, policymakers. He's a master's candidate at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He already has developed a proficiency far beyond anything that I've mastered, which is in Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, and what I pretend to be my native language, English. And so without further ado, I want to turn the stage over to Sam, who will introduce our distinguished guests, who will moderate this session, and then who will open the floor to you so that you can contribute your comments and your questions. And thanks a lot for coming, and I hope that this is the first in a long partnership among us. Thank you.
I want to start by thanking the Middle East Institute, of course, for hosting this very timely discussion. I also want to thank, in a personal note as well, Dr. John Calabrese. We met almost 10 years ago, and he encouraged me to continue in the direction that I have. But in terms of this event, it wouldn't have happened without his direct intervention over the last few weeks in making sure it became a reality. So I want to thank him as well. And with that, introduce the two speakers we have tonight. I'll just give the following preface along the lines of Dr. Calabrese. Our discussion today concerns China's relationship with the Middle East, a strategic relationship that rarely is covered in forums such as this. China's emergence as the linchpin of the Gulf states' energy trade and its more confident diplomacy throughout the region has brought the relationship between China and the Middle East to greater prominence, especially in light of this past year's crises in Syria and Iran. Writers speak of a new Silk Road. They speak of a transcontinental relationship that is expanding across Asia, bringing the West and the East closer together. But generally when they do so, particularly from DC, they limit their discussion to two topics, one being energy, and the second one being the question posed as to whether China may supplant U.S. influence and dominance particularly in U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and even at times Israel. Rarely, very rarely, do we see scholars, both in writing and in speaking, really pushing beyond these topics. We're very fortunate today to have two experts, in many ways, in such a unfortunately limited field, the experts who have and are going to today do exactly that, push beyond the boundaries of what is generally commented on the issue. I won't give their entire bios because you can find that in the sheet that's been handed out. What I will say is that Dr. Yitzhak Shichor is a professor of political science and Asian studies at the University of Haifa in Israel, and he's a professor emeritus at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is far and away the most widely published authority on China's relationship with the Middle East. He's been examining the issue with a level of rigor for close on to 40 years, and we're very fortunate to have him visiting from Israel and therefore our guest this afternoon. Dr. Dawn Murphy is a Princeton, Harvard, China and the World postdoctoral fellow. Her dissertation and ongoing research examined China's role in the Middle East in a great level of detail, and her research including visiting fellowships with the Chinese Academy of Social Science in Beijing and the American University in Cairo, Egypt. I think one thing that you can also notice that we have today is with Dr. Murphy and Dr. Shichor, we have two generations, along the lines perhaps of what Dr. Calabrese spoke, with us, giving us very timely expert perspective. And that two-generational approach will ensure that our discussion today will both touch upon the past while looking at the questions we have today. You see this on the pamphlet. I'll reiterate it for everyone's benefit. The two key questions that we're going to ask our speakers to respond to with us now is, number one, what challenges has China faced as a result of the political upheaval in the Arab world and the dispute over Iran's nuclear program? And number two, in light of these challenges, how and how well has China managed to protect and promote its interests in the region? I'm going to ask Dr. Murphy to speak first, followed by Dr. Shichor. Following their remarks, we're going to open the floor to questions. A central motivation behind having this event was to have a forum for discussion. So please write down your questions and save them for the Q&A at the end. With that in mind, please join me in welcoming Dr. Murphy to initiate our discussion today.
Thank you very much for having me here today. Is that better? Okay. To all of you. I have a lot of ground to cover, and I only have 20 minutes. So we'll save some of the discussion for the Q&A. I don't know which particular areas you are going to be most interested in, but as I said, we're going to go through a lot of material fairly fast. My focus is looking at China's interests and behavior in the Middle East from 1991 to 2010. I'm not going to make any comments in my formal presentation regarding the post-Arab Spring or the evolving situation. I know Dr. Shichor will be, and then in Q&A we'll discuss that. Also, when I say Middle East, in my research I define Middle East as including North Africa, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. Okay, so it's a very broad definition. Okay. And from a methodology standpoint, Sam already mentioned that I did research both in China and Egypt. A lot of my comments are based on interviews conducted with over 100 government officials, scholars, economic actors, etc., both in China, Egypt, but also from embassies ranging from Oman, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Tunisia, Jordan, Palestine, etc. So this is based on a very broad range of interview data as well. Okay. So first of all, my overall argument is that as a rising power towards these regions, China is a mercantilist rising power that is deeply influenced by its identity as a developing country. And the mercantilist piece will cover, especially in relation to interests, but that's the overall argument that we'll come back to at the end of the discussion. So China has four primary interests in the Middle East in this post-Cold War environment. The first is fueling China's own domestic economic growth through both acquiring resources and markets for Chinese goods and services. So on the resources side, in 1993, China became a net importer of oil, as many of you already know. By 2010, it was importing almost $100 billion a year worth of primarily oil and gas from the Middle East. To give some context, China right now is the second largest oil importer in the world, and 40% of its oil comes from the Middle East. And the top suppliers for China in the Middle East are Saudi, Iran, Oman, Iraq, Kuwait, and Libya. For markets for goods and services, China is exporting close to $90 billion a year as of 2010. And the markets that they're targeting are light industrial goods, textiles, clothing, machinery, automobiles. It's a very broad range of products. And the top markets for those goods are the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Iran, Saudi, and Egypt. From a market standpoint, China is also targeting the services sector, whether it be construction, finance, telecommunications. To give you an idea of scope, in 2009, China's service exports in the construction sector of the Middle East was around $22 billion a year. So one of my biggest points on this is it's to fuel China's economic growth, but you hear in the media a lot about it being oil, gas. I would argue that it's a much more robust need for economic interaction with this region, and seeing these countries, especially the more populous, more developed countries in the region, as very promising markets for Chinese goods going forward. China's second major interest in the region is gaining support from other countries in the international arena in a world of emerging multipolarity. This is particularly a concern in the mid-2000s going forward, but you see after the financial crisis, this appears to be a growing interest, both from the standpoint of the Chinese seeing this multipolarity emerge more quickly than expected, but also wanting to bring in other countries for support. China's third major interest in relation to the Middle East is China's own domestic stability. And what I mean by that is particularly in relation to Xinjiang and ensuring that it has support from various Muslim governments for its anti-insurgency activities in that region. This has become a heightened area of concern since 2009 and recent riots. It tends to particularly affect China's relations with Turkey, both from public opinion on the Turkish side, but also the ranking of Turkey's importance in Chinese foreign policy. So really wanting to have that support. And the fourth major interest for China in this region is more ideological. So it's that of promoting the interests of developing countries, third world countries, non-Western countries, non-white countries. I mean, you can define this many different ways. And this is tied into a much longer history of support for anti-colonial, anti-imperial activities in the past. But I do think that this is a major piece driving some of China's behavior, the actual content of China's behavior in the region. So the four interests, again, were fueling domestic growth, supporting the international system, China's own domestic stability, and then the developing country identity. Next, I want to talk about China's concrete behavior in relation to these interests. And again, I'm going to go through this quickly because I actually have 13 I want to cover, so some of them are going to be covered very quickly, right? So first would be cooperation forums. China, in 2004, established a China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, which is the primary multilateral cooperation mechanism between China and League of Arab States members. Okay. It encompasses economics, politics, a tiny bit of security. It's not security focused. Culture, agriculture, pretty much any functional area you can think about in relations between countries is in scope for this organization. So that was established in 2004. It meets every 2 years. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation includes northern African states. So there is some overlap here when you talk about the Middle East. There's actually 2 cooperation forums that represent some of those states. That was set up in 2000. It meets every 3 years. At a very high level, I've been asked to actually talk about China's approach to the international system. Is it being revisionist versus more, status quo oriented? So on each of these, I'll make a quick comment about that. These cooperation forums, I would argue, are revisionist, both towards the distribution of power in the regions. They exclude the U.S., they exclude other great powers, but also towards some of the rules of the international system. So if you look at, political rules, for example, these forums are founded on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, as opposed to a more liberal international political order. Another major foundation from the political side is South-South cooperation within these forums, which I think is also quite anti-revisionist. On the economic side, the revisionist piece would be in relation to free markets and the role of the state in the economy. And we can talk about this in a lot more detail if you want to, but China's insertion of the state into various economic activities and tying these economic activities to various political initiatives via these forums is a different approach than what would be the ideal approach under a liberal economic order. The second foreign policy tool I want to talk about is the Special Envoy for Middle East Issues. This was established in 2000. It's particularly focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict and providing China a voice in that process. I label this as revisionist also, but I would say it's not heavily revisionist. I have it labeled as revisionist because it's an attempt by China to insert itself into this process that is a relatively US-dominated, and I would say Western-dominated process. The third foreign policy tool would be United Nations Security Council voting. What I tend to look at for this would be differences in the Security Council between the US and China voting on various issues over time. Most of the differences in voting fall around territorial integrity issues, sanctions, and the jurisdiction of the criminal court. And so that's one area where you have differences in voting. Another area where you have differences in voting is around support for the, basically the Arab side of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So various resolutions in the Security Council criticizing Israel for actions. China often votes either, yes or abstain when the U.S. votes no, and so you see that difference there. So I label this as revisionist, anti-hegemonic, also around these core norms of non-interference, as opposed to a liberal political economic order of promoting, democracy and various other values, and then directly in relation to the U.S. around the Arab-Israeli issue. The fourth foreign policy tool is strategic partnerships. China has established a number of these in recent years: 1999 with Egypt, 1999 with Saudi Arabia, 2004 with Algeria, 2012 with the United Arab Emirates, and there's one that is planned for Turkey. So China, I labeled this as revisionist, anti-hegemonic as well, because China is targeting the largest regional powers for these partnerships. The fifth foreign policy tool, top leader visits. There's been just a flurry of this type of activity that I'm sure you've seen in the media in various ways. But to give you an idea, the Jiang Zemin administration, so Jiang and Zhu Rongji and Li Peng, that administration made formal visits to Egypt. Actually, Egypt 3 times, Morocco 3 times, Algeria twice, Turkey twice, Iran once, Israel, Libya, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia. Under the WHO administration, you have visits to Egypt, Saudi, Morocco, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates. This is a very high level of top leader attention to these countries and interaction. And again, these visits over time are targeting the largest, rising powers within those regions. So I labeled that as revisionist as well. The next category, free trade agreements. In the Middle East, the one that has been pursued is with the Gulf Cooperation Council. This was announced in 2004. Through the end of 2010, there had been 5 rounds of negotiations. To my knowledge, it's still an ongoing process that has not been completed. That I label as revisionist anti-hegemonic towards the distribution of power, just because it's exclusively between China and the GCC. The 7th foreign policy tool would be support of national champions. So this is China's support primarily for state-owned enterprises and their activities in these regions. So this is anywhere from providing financing to targeting specific countries for investment or interaction, providing various incentives for these companies. There's a very strong involvement of the state in companies going into these regions. Which again, revisionist towards the rules of the international system and the role of the state in a free market economy. The 8th foreign policy tool is special economic zones. 2 of those have been established. One was in Egypt in 1994. It's on the Suez Canal, and it's still slowly coming into operation. It's been a very long time in the making. There was also one established in Algeria in 2006, but that has been suspended. There doesn't seem to be a lot of activity around that. The next foreign policy tool is United Nations peacekeeping operations. You do see China involving itself more since 1990. In the 1990s, it was more in observer capacity. So for the UN Iraq-Kuwait observer mission, they sent 164 observers. In the 2000s, in relation to Lebanon, they actually sent, at least as of the end of 2010, they had sent 1,187 troops. This activity I categorize as status quo integrationist because China's going through United Nations, going through established international organizations, really utilizing the rules of the international system in a way that is not in any way challenging the status quo. The next tool, Anti-Piracy Operations. This is in relation to the Gulf of Aden. And in 2008, the People's Liberation Navy launched its first mission outside of China's territorial waters. I categorize this also as status quo integrationist. It's done in a relatively multilateral fashion with the rest of the international community. The 11th foreign policy tool is military exchanges. Since 2000, China has conducted high-level military exchanges with every country in the Middle East except for Iraq. And when you look at the data behind these, it tends to be focused on regional powers, the larger countries. The top 3 participants in military exchanges have been Egypt, Turkey, and Syria through the end of 2010, which is important to note because things clearly could have changed since then. The 12th foreign policy tool is conventional arms sales. When you look in the 1990s and 2000s, it's at a minimal level. In the 1980s, you had a fairly high level of conventional arms sales both to Iran and Iraq in the war, right? But since then, it's a very low level. So I categorize that as status quo pragmatist. And finally, in a completely different area, Confucius Institutes, China, I think many of you are probably familiar with this. They started establishing these in 2004. As of the end of 2010, China had established them in Egypt, Iran, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. So broad coverage of these Confucius Institutes. So we've just talked very quickly about a number of foreign policy tools. I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion that my primary argument is that China's a mercantilist, developing, rising power. Its behavior is varying, I would say, dramatically across functional areas. In the political and economic realm, its behavior is primarily revisionist, anti-hegemonic, driven by its intense need for this region to fuel China's economic growth. So for the resources, for the markets, okay? That said, in the realm of military interaction, it's behaved in a very status quo, integrationist with the international system way. So I would argue the reason you see this differentiation in its rising power behavior is because it doesn't have any territorial aspirations in these regions. It really is driven by these domestic political concerns. Another piece also is that in this region in particular, especially compared to Africa and some other regions, it does not want to be seen as coming into direct conflict with the United States and perceives that this is a U.S. sphere of influence where it does not want to risk its relations with the U.S. And finally, I would say that I think that this behavior and this interaction has been incredibly effective. If you look at the number of interactions, the ways in which they're involved in the region, how robust this relationship has become over the last 10 years, I think China's efforts up till 2010 had been very successful. And I know we're going to discuss more about what's happening since the beginning of the Arab Spring. But China has robust relations and is very involved. So, and that's my 20 minutes. So thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank John for this real occasion, opportunity. I think we've known each other not, by meeting, but for so many years. It was about time that we meet, and this is really a great opportunity for me. I wrote some notes, to start with this presentation, but I'm tempted to respond to Don's comments. Before that, I just want to say that whatever we say about China and the Middle East, in my view at least, it all depends on something else, on the situation between China and the United States, on the future of Sino-US relations. And I think China is now at a kind of a crossroads, a junction. There is a new lineup of leadership just elected or appointed, last week or a couple of weeks ago. And in the United States, of course, Obama began his, or is about to begin his second term. And I think both leaderships in the United States and in China will have to make up their mind about many issues in the international system, including, of course, the Middle East, which is going to be a byproduct. It's not an independent variable. It is a dependent variable. We'll have to make up the mind about the situation. And as far as China is concerned, I think China's new leadership is facing now a number of dilemmas, very, very important dilemmas. And what I had planned at the beginning was to give you kind of a list of these dilemmas, about 10 or 12 dilemmas that the Chinese leadership will have to solve probably within the next year or two, because it takes time for the leadership to settle down. And I know that in the media and also some academics say that this new leadership now is a little conservative, that we shouldn't expect too much of the new leaders, probably more of the same. I don't think so. I think we may be surprised by the new leaders, perhaps not next week or next month, but perhaps next year or the year after. Some people say that this leadership is conservative, but of course, in order to be appointed, in order to get these offices, they had somehow to please the party elders, the Chinese Communist Party elders, because otherwise they would not been given this position. And we know the story of Bo Xilai, who was a little bit kind of radical and offered some alternative ideas, some alternative let's say, ideology, which China doesn't have right now, and we know his fate. So the new leadership will have to deal with some problems also in the Middle East, and I named some of these problems, and maybe we shall go back to them during the Q&A period. Just I'll mention very, very briefly the question of stability and instability, the question of intervention or non-intervention in the Middle East, the question of dependence that came out also in Dawn's talk about dependence on commodities, on energy, and so on, and some other relations with Iran, China's attitude toward Iran's nuclear program, the question of arms sale, China's stand on terrorism, and so on. So there are many, many questions that the leadership will have to make up its mind. Now, one thing before I go to some other points is that when we say dilemmas, we have to understand dilemmas in a Chinese context, not in a Western context. It's never an either-or situation. It's a question of a balance of the right proportion between the different sides, different aspects of these dilemmas. So maybe later on we'll come back to these issues. Now, I'm sorry, I'm kind of, but I feel I have to respond to some of the points raised by Dawn, and I must say right at the beginning that Dawn has a number of advantages over me. And I'm not talking about the looks, I'm not talking, which is certainly much better. I'm not talking about the age, definitely much better. And but I'm talking about the ability, to undertake field studies in the Middle East, in different countries of the Middle East, and also in China. Something that I don't have. I don't have, most of the Arab countries I cannot visit for obvious reasons. And I think maybe this is kind of a disadvantage, because meeting people, interviewing, provide you with maybe different kind of outlooks. And also I cannot visit China. And I promised, I think, John, to say a few words about that. I'm blacklisted in China. And all I had to do with this university, I mean, it is related to a project started over 10 years ago at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, I think, on Xinjiang. Maybe some of you know, I mean, this project was started, I think, 2001, and it collected a bunch of people, experts in different aspects of Xinjiang in China. My assignment was the military. And shortly after the project had been launched, I was invited to China. I got an official invitation to China for the first time. Of course, I'd been in China and in Xinjiang before, but this was the first time I had an official invitation. All expenses paid, again, first and last time. And during this visit, they began questioning me about this project. Say, the CIA, right? This is a CIA project. And I say, no, I mean, this is an academic project financed by the Henry Luce Foundation and so on. Well, I'll make it short. Probably after I returned, this was the summer of 2002, someone decided to put all contributors to this project and the editors on a blacklist. Because someone said, I mean, that the book, even before it was published, because they had all the drafts and everything, that the book was subversive, that it promoted separatism in Xinjiang. So all of us, were put on a blacklist. The book was published in 2004, and probably is the most comprehensive book on modern Xinjiang ever published. The most comprehensive book ever published. And some of the contributors managed to go back to China. I know some of them, my colleagues, are back in China, but only those of you who studied Chinese history and culture and civilization will understand what I'm saying now, only after they wrote self-criticism. Self-criticism, they wrote letters of apology. I'm sorry, I didn't know about the project, I didn't know it's going to I'll never go to Xinjiang again, I forget about Xinjiang, and so on. And then, of course, they were treated with a lot of respect. They were given, visiting professorships in Chinese universities and accommodation, whatever. I refused to sign something like that, and therefore I'm blacklisted in China. I managed to sneak into China in 2005, legally. But, I mean, there was a meeting in South China at Xiamen University, and I was given a visa after a little kind of, pressure. I was given a visa for just 7 days and limited only to the south of China, so that I will not have any idea of going to the northwest. So this is my disadvantage, again, because I cannot go to China. I can get as many books as I want, and I may speak to some people who are visiting, but I cannot go to China right now. So let me, you tell me what to stop, when to stop. I heard what Don was saying, and how should I put it? I would like to say the opposite. And on each of these issues, on each of these, and I think this is good, because it's the way we study, this is the way we learn, by being skeptical about, and trying to look different, different directions, and reconsider all other possibilities. So number one, that China's main consideration or main motivation in international politics is economic. That China is driven by the need of economic growth. This is how they think they could satisfy the population. Now, for many years, I used to think the same way. That in Mao's time, we usually think that China was driven by ideological and security consideration, and in the post-Mao period, it's mainly technological and economic considerations. As I said earlier, I mean, it's never in China, it's never either or. It's a question of a kind of a balance, and in a kind of an yin-yang perception. So I think even today, although China needs a lot of resources, a lot of commodities, a lot of energy from outside, the basic consideration that drives China's foreign policy, international behavior, is still the political. It's always the political. Everything in China eventually, ultimately, is political. So the way that China perceives itself in the world, the need to cope with competitors, especially with the United States. So even if economics is now a very important tool in China's international relations, ultimately it has some political aims, political goals. Now, just to say something about the oil import that was mentioned, that about 40%, I think you said, comes from the Middle East. Again, I mean, one of the issues is how do you define the Middle East? There are all kinds of definitions of the Middle East. And I accept very much Don's definition, but I would even expand it a little bit, and I'll add, let's say, Sudan for me is part of the Middle East. It's part of the Middle East because, for me, the Middle East, coming from Israel, of course, Middle East is the Arab League countries, plus three, plus Turkey, plus Iran, and so on. So if we look at this region, I think China gets much more than 40% of its oil from this region. And there is also some kind of misperception or misunderstanding about how much oil China import at all. And some people will say, I don't know, what the share of import to consumption in China. Some people will say, what, it's 60%, 55%, 60%, something like that. And I think, again, this is much more, because there is something we forget. When we try to calculate the share of import in China's overall oil consumption, so we take the consumption minus production, and then we have import, right? Wrong. I mean, because we tend to forget that the Chinese still export oil. It is true that in 1993, China became a net oil importer, but China continues to export oil all the time. The last figures I had, 20% of China's oil production output is still exported to countries like Japan and North Korea. So you have China's consumption minus production minus export, and then you have the import, the share of import in consumption, which is probably today, in my view, close to 70% already, and it will go more. It will increase more in the future. And the share of the Middle East is, I think, about something like 60%, mostly from the Arab Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Iran. And again, in the question and answer, we can speak a little bit about this question of balancing between Iran and Saudi Arabia in terms of China's oil. About trade, again, I mean, one problem is we should be careful not to use absolute figures. I mean, absolute figures don't tell us anything. I mean, we have to look at it relatively. I mean, let's say 20 billion US dollars compared to what? Is it much? Is not much, and so on. So we have to look at that. And you mentioned Turkey. One thing about Turkey is, of course, that the Turks are very concerned about the imbalance, a huge imbalance in trade with China. I think overall trade between Turkey and China is now should be about 21, 22, 23 billion US dollars. And I think over 2/3 of it is Chinese exports, Chinese export to Turkey. By the way, Turkey's foreign trade deficit, overall foreign trade deficit, is the second in the world after the United States. So there are a lot of economic problems in Turkey. And the Turkey press, editorials and people and so on, all kinds of commercial organizations are very concerned about it, very concerned about it. And they say, okay, every Chinese ship that enters a harbor in Turkey means that the plant and the factory has to close down, So it's not so simple. I mean, it's sometimes very, very complicated. Now, third point is about stability. You mentioned stability and stability in Xinjiang, domestic stability. Again, I mean, we are using all these terms again and again and again. And by the way, we are very much influenced by Chinese rhetoric. I mean, it's like brainwashing. You know, we are used to all these words again and again. So at a certain point of time, we accept these words, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't. So domestic stability and instability, again, I mean, are not absolute terms, are relative terms. I mean, there are, a different kind of situation. And I know that China prefers one of the main, let's say, goals of China's international policy or behavior is international stability because it's good for business. It's good for business. Well, let me tell you something. Sometimes a little instability is better for business. Let's take Sudan, for example. I mean, take Sudan. Suppose Sudan was peaceful and quiet like, let's say, Switzerland. And all these corporations, Western corporations, and oil companies that left Sudan because of the civil war, because of all these situations of internal tension, whatever, we come back to Sudan. Then the Chinese will have to face very tough competition that they don't have to face right now. So a little instability is good for business. Not much, but a little instability is good for business. Now, let me come back to Xinjiang, which, well, the reason I'm here is because we had a conference last week around National Defense University, Carnegie, and so on, conference on what was it on? It was on the People's Liberation, contingency planning PLA style. I mean, how the Chinese People's Liberation Army prepares itself for all kinds of contingencies. And my assignment was to deal with the PLA's response to major ethnic unrest, mainly in Xinjiang. And I wrote about it before, but I want to say it again. There are many were interested in inflating the tension in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is not that, let's say, in kind of a turmoil that people sometimes think. If you look at the figures, at the facts, and so on, and so there are in Xinjiang population is about 20 something like 22 million, 23 million, and Uyghurs constitute about 10 or 11 million. But in China's overall population, about 0.75%, 0.75%, less than 1%. And even Uyghurs are not a homogeneous group. There are different kinds of Uyghurs. There are Uyghurs in the south of China, of Xinjiang, and those in the north. Those in the south are more orthodox, more conservative, more religious, and so on. And those in the north are a little more urban, a little more secular, and so on. And when I'm still from my visits to Xinjiang, I spoke to some people, and they told me Uyghur family from the north will never marry a Uyghur family from the south. So, I mean, there are different kinds of Uyghurs. And I would say a tiny minority are really interested in separatism, on achieving independence and independent state and so on. And of course, if I know that, and some other people know that, the Chinese also know that. So much of what's going on in Xinjiang is a game, is a kind of Chinese attempt to manipulate the situation in order to apply pressure on other governments, especially the Turkish government was mentioned, Central Asian government, Pakistan, and so on. And the funniest thing, of course, is the Uyghurs are also interested in inflating the situation to show that they are still active, they're still an organization, they still aspire to achieve, a state one day. And by the way, they take Israel as a model, but that's another issue. And also, the media is very much interested. The media likes blood. When you had these riots in July 2009. People said, okay, the Chinese military intervened and so on. I tell you something, Chinese military did not intervene. Hardly in any situation in Xinjiang over the last 30 years, okay, post-Mao period, there was no military intervention. It was the People's Armed Police, it was the militia, it was the Bing Tuan and so on, but not the military. Okay, I'll continue. Just a word, you stopped me, huh? You spoke about the China's being a revisionist, and China about Chinese views about the international system and multipolarity and so on. I think what we are seeing now is there was a second stage after second phase after the collapse of the Soviet Union that people talk a lot about this multipolarity. That Europe, and China, and then you have the of course the United States and so on. It's going to be a multipolar system. What we see now, in fact, is a return to a bipolar system. I mean, this is so obvious. I mean, a return to a bipolar system. We have the United States, and we have China. But there is a very big difference between these two systems, because the previous system, the United States and the Soviet Union, was a confrontational system. The two sides were completely separated. There was hardly any trade between the Soviet Union and the United States. And you could not have imagined, it was inconceivable, let's say, for Boeing or for McDonnell Douglas to set up a factory, plant factory in the Soviet Union. Could you imagine something like that? Now, when we are talking about China, or Sino-US relations, it is a complementary kind of international system, because the two powers are intertwined, are interconnected by economic relationships and so on. And perhaps this is going to do good for the stability of the international system at all. And when I started this talk, I said something about this new leadership in China and President Obama being re-elected. I think we could expect an improvement in Sino-US relations within the next 5, 10 years, or even more, because the two sides realize there is no way out. I mean, there is no other way. The two sides have somehow to accommodate. And I think President Obama will have now, second term, the self-confidence to, to approach the Chinese to come to some kind of an agreement. And of course, I may be wrong. So next time you invite me, and I say, okay, I failed. But just if you look at the Sino-U.S. relations as a kind of at the macro level, there are cycles. There are cycles of Sino-U.S. relations. First cycle from 1949 to 1969. This was the cycle of hostility. This was the cycle of confrontation. At that time, we had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, and so on. Second cycle from 1969 to 1989, this was the honeymoon between U.S. and China. Establishment of diplomatic relations, Nixon visit, and military relations, whatever. 1989, after Tiananmen and the collapse of the Soviet Union, to 2009, again we have a period of tension in Sino-U.S. relations. And maybe the next cycle that had started in 2009 may bring another improvement in Sino-U.S. relations. And this is, of course, going to affect also the Middle East. That's it? Okay. Final point. You mentioned ideology. And the Chinese interest is in the promotion of third world issues, kind of protecting third world, what we used to call developing countries and so on. I think the Chinese, couldn't care less about the third world. I mean, this is something different. Third world was left behind long time ago. Now China is mainly for itself. Of course, it has to cultivate all these relations with neighboring countries in Central Asia and Southeast Asia and so on, and countries all over the world. But this is done more in a kind of traditional, Sino-centric ways, that from above. Yeah, from above. China is not equal to any of these countries. China does not consider itself equal to this country. And there are some other points, but we'll deal with that later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. As I said in the beginning, the prime motivation in organizing this event was to have a discussion with these two experts. So we're going to welcome questions. Please raise your hand and I will call on you. I prepared several questions myself. Please raise your hand, and after I point you out, one of our helpers will give you a microphone. I have questions myself, but I'd prefer if you hear yours. Please indicate, identify yourself, and then you can indicate who you're asking your question to as well. Thank you.
I'm honored to be the first. My name is Ken Audrey. I'm a former Foreign Service officer with the State Department. A lot of assignments in both Middle East and in China. And my question is for Professor Shichor. I was struck by your comments, especially on Xinjiang. Just to give you an anecdote, Xinjiang is below the radar for most of us Americans, even educated ones. And I had to be in China to learn about it, where some journalists gave me, who knew I knew Arabic, gave me a newspaper to read. And I looked at the newspaper and something was wrong. Couldn't read all the words, only a couple. And then I realized it was Turkish, pre-Ataturk Turkish in the Arabic, and that's how I learned about Xinjiang. Made some friends there. But even though it's under the carpet, or for most of us, I think it is important. This was back in the 90s. And I want to ask you one question that may be a little politically incorrect. Do the Chinese possibly see a parallel between their experience or their situation in Xinjiang and that of Israel in the occupied territory?
Okay. I know that these parallels come up in some of the publication. My colleague Drew Gladney mentioned it once. I I've never seen anything like that in Chinese publications. What I can tell you is, as I mentioned earlier, is the parallel the Uyghurs see between the history, modern history of Israel, or even between Zionism and the Uyghur national movement. You know, they said to me more than once, look at you, for so many years you did not have your country. And finally, in the end, you got it. And I tried to explain to them that the situation is completely different. And Xinjiang is considered an integral part of China. All governments that recognize China recognize China's territorial integrity, including Xinjiang, I would say even including Taiwan, potentially at least. So there is no way, and of course China is becoming stronger every day. The chances of Uyghurs to achieve their independence or to recreate restore the Eastern Turkestan Republic that existed in the late 1940s is zero. There is no way at all. And again, they understand that. I mean, this is not a session on Xinjiang. We could go on to speak about it, but I don't think that the analogy is acceptable in this case, because of course the West Bank and so on are not recognized, as we saw in the United Nations just a few days ago, not recognized as part of Israel.
I'm going to suggest let's take 2 questions, and so if that gentleman, and then afterwards.
Hi, my name is Adam Azim. I'm a grad student at American University studying U.S. foreign policy, and this is an open question for the panel. Who's more willing to accept the upheaval and the changes in the Middle East politically? Who's more willing to accept the changes, the United States or China?
Hi, my name is Zainab. I'm an intern at the Center for American Progress. I'm from Tunisia. And my question is for all of you. So China as a rising power, like what role could it have in promoting a less offensive and more pro-peace solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict?
Okay. As far as the more willing to accept change, I honestly think a lot of it depends on what ultimately the regimes look like in the Middle East, because in 2010 before, I think there's not a lot of concern over what the domestic political situation looks like, as long as it's a country willing to trade and interact with China. So if you had, a highly Islamicized environment where China's being criticized about Xinjiang and about, all of these issues, and that becomes a point of tension, I think that could be problematic. Or if you have a turn inward in some of these societies being more protectionist and not, interacting. But as long as they're willing to interact with China, I don't think China cares as much as the U.S. potentially, I think, cares a lot more about the form of some of these regimes. And as far as the role that China can play, I want Professor Shichor to talk a lot more about this. The feedback that I received was that, at least right now, China's really not. China has this envoy. It was set up at the urging of the Arab states. The Arab states want China to be involved because it's seen as a more balanced player and potentially, a party that could be productive, but that at this point anyway, it's a lot of going from country to country and being involved at a very minimal level. So I would love to hear what you have to say on this.
Israel Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu always said, when you ask him a question, he says, "This is not the question." And then he says whatever he wants to say. And so it's not a question of who cares more about the situation, about unrest in the Middle East. It's a question of who is ready to do something about it. This is the question. Who is ready to do something about it? And as we know, of course, the United States is ready to do and is doing a lot about it, not always successfully, but at least trying. While the Chinese, although they published late October this 4 points program for settling the Syrian crisis, the Chinese do not want to become involved, too much involved in the Middle East, to interfere in the internal affairs of the Middle East, of certain countries, to undermine their sovereignty, and so on. So, in this respect, China is still not a part of the Middle East power game. Of course, when we ask the Chinese when China is going to be more proactive in the Middle East, they say when China will be stronger. Well, in my mind, China is already quite strong, but nevertheless, this is not the way the Chinese feel about it, probably, and so maybe given time, the Chinese will become more involved. One of the principles of China is not to alienate, the different parties. The Chinese want to make friends with everybody. So they have good relations with Israel, they have good relations with Palestinians, they have good relations with the Arab countries, with Saudi Arabia and Iran and so on. And I think given, if we look at it in retrospectively, this was quite a successful policy so far. So there is no need for the change to change it. I think I think you said something also about criticism about China, about Xinjiang and so on. Just let me add something which connects to what I said at the beginning about Chinese, about rhetoric in general, and maybe about diplomacy. Diplomacy, I think, is the art of forgetfulness. I mean, you say something, and within a week or a month or a year, you forget it. I mean, it's not. And I remember after the July 2009 riots in Urumqi, in Xinjiang, Erdogan, if you remember, came out and said that this suppression, the Chinese brutal suppression of the riots, was something like a genocide. They used the word genocide. He didn't say it was a genocide, something like a genocide. And you could have expected that this kind of statement will undermine Sino-Turkish relations, would harm Sino-Turkish relations. Not at all. I mean, within a week or two, everything was forgotten. I mean, the statement was there, and Sino-Turkish relations continued to improve. So we don't have, it reminds me of a colleague of mine, I won't mention her name, who wrote about China and the Middle East after the Gulf War, when the Chinese, of course, facilitated by abstaining on Resolution 678, facilitated the U.S.-led offensive against Saddam Hussein in 1991. And she wrote that the Arabs will never forget China's betrayal, China's betrayal of them. Well, nothing at all. I mean, of course they forgot. I mean, that's not the... about if I understood correctly about the Arab-Israeli conflict, are the Chinese interested in the settlement of the conflict? What was the question?
No, the question was, China is a new rising power, and I consider that could the U.S. have a unilateral view of the conflict. So, my question was how the U.S., how China can help a more peaceful and more multilateral resolution of the conflict.
Oh, I mean, that's a good question, of course. I mean, it relates to what I said earlier. I mean, maybe the Chinese can do something, but they don't want to do right now. They do not want to do something or anything right now. In my previous visits to China, when I was still kosher, Chinese scholars and Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and so on asked me a similar question: what can China do? The fact is, China can do very, very little, because China is a newcomer in the Middle East. It doesn't have this long history of relations with the Middle East, and interest, and maybe even understanding, a deep understanding of the Middle East. And I suggest, why don't you take something out of your experience and see if it can apply to the Middle East? What I meant was, let's say, the regime that was established in Shanghai, different concessions and so on, or even Hong Kong, or even the principle one country, two system. Take this kind of idea that has been practiced for a long time in history, successfully or not, I mean, debatable, and see if it can be applied, let's say, for for Jerusalem. I mean, status of Jerusalem. One city, two systems, or something like that. But it's been a long time since I raised this issue. Nothing has been done about it.
We're going to take several questions again. So again, if people can all raise their hand.
We have two over here.
Perfect.
All right, if you insist. Robert Shredder, international investor. I wonder if either of you can share with us a little more information about Iran. We know most of the Western world has placed pretty tight sanctions on Iran, especially their oil exporting. Do you have any information or insight about how China is helping to defeat those sanctions? And have you seen any further evidence about technological transfers between China and Iran?
You're taking two.
Yeah, please. We're going to take several questions.
I'm Helen Raffel. I'm a MEI member. I worked in China for 5 years. In the mid-1990s, when I was working in Beijing, I had Xinjiang friends in Beijing, and we traveled to Urumqi together by train. And the difference in treatment between the Uyghurs, who were native Chinese, and me was astonishing, because they had to take apart all of his luggage to examine it and give him a thorough exam, and they just passed me through and so forth. So the first part of my question is, I wonder, is it still that way? Is it very differential treatment between the two types? The mirror image of the question is, I have heard that the Chinese who are working in East Africa or the Middle East receive the same kind of adverse prejudice and dislike, because they're assumed to be taking jobs away from the locals and acting superior and so forth. So in these two situations, is there very differential treatment of what seems like foreigners to the natives?
We'll take a few more questions. This gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm John Parker from National Defense University. I wondered what the Chinese think of Russian diplomacy and influence and presence in the Middle East, and how they take that into consideration as they fashion their own rising activities there.
If there aren't any more questions, we'll go to the panel. What do you want to go first?
Can we do Iran?
Iran, okay. Okay, I'd say two things about Sino-Iranian relations. Number one, of course, China is in principle against sanctions. The Chinese believe that sanctions hurt the people much more than the government, and that sanctions are not going to change Iran's policy, certainly not on the issue of nuclear weapons. And of course, the Chinese try all kinds of ways to bypass the sanctions by providing Iran. You know, Iran has a lot of oil, but this is crude oil. What the Iran doesn't have is processed oil. I mean, refined oil, and which is still being imported to Iran. And one of the, the sanctions affect Iran especially in this kind of import of refined oil. And the Chinese, as far as I heard, help Iran to bypass all these sanctions. The second part of this, of what I'm going to say is why, of course, why. How can we understand Sino-Iranian relations? Why China has been supporting Iran, even Iran's nuclear, although they said this is a peaceful use nuclear program. Why the Chinese, have been supported Iran all along? And the answer, some people say, okay, this is because of oil. It's not because of oil. I mean, because China can get all the oil it needs, let's say, from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia offered China all the oil that it needs. And there are at least, I think, 4 refineries being built in China to refine Saudi oil. So this is a long-term kind of relationship. Iran is not that important. Iran used to supply, if I remember correctly, about 15% of China's oil import in the past, and it went down, I mean, to 6, 7, 8, 9% and so on over the last few years. Whereas, of course, Saudi Arabia now supply about 1/4 of Iran's oil. So why? And in my view, it's a question of politics. It's a question of maybe power politics, because to some extent, Iran is a Chinese proxy that is related to Taiwan much more than to the Middle East. When the Chinese are concerned about U.S., let's say, arms supplies to Taiwan or some kind of other military commitment and so on, since they cannot react directly in the context of Taiwan, they react in the context of Iran. So if the United States decides to supply, let's say, Taiwan with some kind of, weapons and so on, then Chinese respond by doing something for Iran in this respect. And we have to look at this, in a kind of a more comprehensive perspective. And now the second question, would you like to?
Yeah, let me. Well, so I don't want to speak so much domestically about Xinjiang. I think you're more of an expert on that. But as far as Chinese,
Amateur.
Yeah, Chinese. Where did she go? Oh, there she is. As far as Chinese workers in the Middle East and Africa, you're asking what the perception is of the local population towards them. I think it varies quite a bit, because you have two major populations of Chinese workers in those regions. One would be employees of large state-owned enterprises that come in for contracts for 6 months or a year. And when you tend to see, 10,000 Chinese workers come in on a site, it tends to be affiliated with those projects. You also have a population of more individual immigrants that are setting up small shops, businesses, merchants. So you have different tensions in those two situations. One, with the larger SOEs, occasionally, the local population, especially in certain sectors as far as construction, will be concerned about the impact on the local labor market, or wanting those firms to actually buy local components, or materials. But I think the bigger tension you see is between the small merchants and the small business owners, and merchants that are local. So there is tension. It's a really, really complicated issue, because the Chinese, in a lot of cases, behave in ways that they isolate themselves, but they are taking away economic opportunities from locals. So it's not necessarily a harmonious relationship between the two, but I don't think it's either side's fault necessarily. It's just part of that dynamic. I did want to note, though, in Egypt, for example, you don't have the situation with the large construction crews, because local law requires that for every Chinese or any foreign employee brought in, you have to have 7 Egyptians. So when you have national regulations that prohibit that type of mass importing of labor, it's not going to happen. So, I mean, I know it's hard when you're in an asymmetric relationship and to have that, but in a lot of cases, this is the local government's own regulations and own bidding on contracts that include large amounts of Chinese labor in order to get the low prices for those contracts are ultimately responsible for the tens of thousands of Chinese in their country. On Russia, I did want to make a comment that during my research, like 2010, before this didn't come up. It seemed to be a non-issue both on the Chinese and the Arab side, the Middle Eastern side. Historically, different issue, right? So before the end of the Cold War. I would say since the beginning of the Arab Spring, though, you see with Syria, I think that China is concerned about what's happening in Syria, has these normative oppositions to intervention, but uses Russia. If Russia's going to veto anyway, it's a cheap veto for China. But that veto is really unusual. If you look back 1990 forward, the only veto for China in the Middle East or Africa was around Rwanda. They hadn't used their veto power on Iraq. They vote yes for sanctions for Iran. They do these things that are relatively cooperative in a lot of ways. But in the new Arab Spring environment, both because Russia feels so strongly and is going to veto anyway, and I do think China is trying to demonstrate its concern over U.S. interventionist behavior in the region. So that's where I think the Russia factor comes in now. It's more in the post-Arab Spring environment. I don't know how you feel about that.
I would like to add something about the Chinese in Africa and the Middle East and so on. I think the origins is in China. The origins of this situation is in China. The Chinese are very racial sometimes. So blacks in Africa, we know about many incidents in China involving black, students and so on, and traders and so. And I think when we come to Africa, we have the same kind of distance, between local population and the Chinese. One thing I would like to say is, I called in one of my papers, I called it, I think, colonialism with Chinese characteristics. I mean, the fact is that Chinese companies that are active, let's say, in Africa and so on, they play a rather positive role compared to, let's say, to old colonial companies and powers in this region. It's not only oil. In the case of Sudan, of course, they invest a lot in agriculture, in power stations, in dams, and so on. And overall, they contribute a lot to the population, to the economy of these countries. But again, there is also a lot of criticism against the way Chinese behave in Africa. I know first-hand experience in Israel. About 10 years ago, Israel was the, I think, number 5 market in the world for Chinese labor. Number 5 in absolute terms. So about 20,000 Chinese workers in Israel. And following some, East Asian countries like, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and so on. There is no problem at all. I mean, they live, first of all, they're very disciplined. They're very disciplined. They come, most of them come in groups and live. They don't stay. And they live in different kind of, camps and so on. And normally there are no problems. About the Russian element, I think this is tremendously important. I think people do not realize, and also in the conference that we just had with also National Defense University, there was no paper about any contingency plan the Chinese have, or the People's Liberation has against the possibility, in the case there is going to be some conflict with Russia in the future. And I think this is tremendously important. So far, the Chinese are reconciled, as Don said, to playing second fiddle. It's easier for them. It's much better for them that Russia leads the way. Underneath, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of suspicion between China and Russia, and I think ultimately it may lead to a conflict. Although all borders between China and Russia have been settled. There are agreements and everything. I don't think these agreements are worth the papers they're written on, because Chinese have a very long memory, and there are certain parts of East Asia, the Primorsky Krai, all these East Asian part beyond Khabarovsk and Vladivostok and so on, that Chinese still claim. The fact is, of course, there is an inflow of Chinese population into these regions, and Moscow is terribly concerned about it, about the demographic balance in the Far East, in the maritime territories. Chinese don't mind. I mean, they don't mind the climate, they don't mind the circumstances and anything, and they just move. There is a spillover of population from the Dung Bay, from northeast China, into these regions. So my hunch, sometime in the future, there's going to be some kind of conflict. Also in Central Asia, there is a lot of competition between China and Russia over influence of these regions and so on. So I think I just want to make clear that the Middle East for China is not the most important priority in the world. It's not a priority at all. So if things are going to change otherwise in other places, in other times and so on, they are probably going to affect also the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I believe our time has come to an end. I know that I imagine our experts on the panel as well are very happy to speak to you further, to be in contact personally, so please approach and speak to anyone up here as you wish. I want to thank both of our experts. I want to thank the Middle East Institute. Thank all of you for coming. I can say, again, on a personal note, as someone who has been studying these issues quite intensively, we only scratched the surface of a lot of challenging issues, and I hope that there will be future forums in Washington that will approach them as well. Thank you again.